We're back on the former Plattsburgh Air Force Base inside that gym, which became our home for a couple of days, a ways back, as we recreated the Battle of Plattsburgh and talked a lot about the War of 1812. Our viewers are very familiar with this topic now, and the response to those programs has been tremendous because it's been an education for all of us. We're back again to talk with Jerry Althoff, who we talked with before, an expert on this subject who's going to talk to the public tonight about one of his favorite things. Jerry, welcome back.
Thank you very much. It's good to be back.
How was the trip?
Cold. It's cold and snowy, but I'm from northern Ohio, so this is not unusual for me.
Did you drive it or fly it?
I flew into Burlington and then came across.
I'll tell you, we are recording this program on the 21st day of January. Bizarre weather this season with 30 and 40 degree temperatures when it should have been way below zero, and now we're talking below zero with tremendous chill factors again. Has the weather been that bad in Ohio?
Not quite this bad, but I flew out in a blizzard, so
Did you really?
And after spending 4.5 years in North Dakota, these temperatures are not unknown to me. So
he's an expert on boats, not planes, right?
That's one way of putting it.
Jerry, you're going to talk to the public about a subject that's near and dear to your heart. You spent just about your entire adult life thinking about this, writing about it, and talking about it.
That's correct, and the program will be on the War of 1812 in the Old Northwest, and it will encompass all of the campaigns, starting with the declaration of war, the first disaster at Detroit, following through the Battle of Lake Erie. The emphasis, of course, is on the Battle of Lake Erie because that is what my specialty is, and then the aftermath of the Battle of Lake Erie, the Battle of the Thames, and the follow-up on that.
It's all tied together because it's all part of the War of 1812.
That's
right?
correct. The War of 1812 was fought in theaters of operation. The Lake Champlain, the St. Lawrence River was one theater, the Lake Ontario, the Niagara region, and then Western Lake Erie. And Western Lake Erie was its own little segment of operations during the war, and that's what the program will be about.
Have you always known that the Battle of Plattsburgh was a very important part of that war?
Anybody who knows anything about the War of 1812 knows that the Battle of Plattsburgh was one of the most significant battles of the War of 1812. You can't deal with this war, put the whole thing in perspective, without dealing with the Battle of Plattsburgh. There were only two fleet actions fought during the war, one on Lake Erie, the one I deal with, and the Battle of Plattsburgh. The Battle of Plattsburgh was the second one, and probably, for all intents and purposes, I wouldn't say probably, it was the greatest, most significant battle of the war. And that's saying a lot considering I deal with the Battle of Lake Erie. So.
Yeah. Well, the painting for the Battle of Lake Erie has already been done, right?
That's correct. That was the third in the series that Dean did, and I consulted with him on that, which is why I'm involved in this one.
How can you help but be passionate when you meet a guy like Dean Mosier?
Well,
reinforce your own passion.
That's more or less it. Dean has his passion in art, and I have my passion in the war and writing about the war and researching it. So it's really it's a symbiotic relationship here. We just have our own little areas that we deal with, and they just happen to coincide in this case.
Were you happy with the painting he came up with for your battle?
Oh yeah, it's the detail, it's the process, that more than anything. The fact that, without doubt, it is the most accurate painting done on the Battle of Lake Erie. And of course the Battle of Lake Erie has been a popular topic for artists over the century and a half since the war. And this, just the fact that it was so well researched and with the scholars of the day, and to the point where on the Battle of Lake Erie painting we can point to the deck of the flagship Lawrence and say, this was Carpenter's mate Wilson Mays who manned the pump. This is the pilot who stood right by the helm. This is the officer who was standing by the mainmast. So it's that well detailed, and that's what makes it so great as an educational tool, because we can interpret the entire battle through that one painting.
That's absolutely amazing, but after all, that's the beauty of trying to recreate history. That's why we all came back here some weeks back and laid out the floor in this base gym, and in a sense, at that time, we kind of rewrote the history book a little bit, didn't we?
I think we actually did, because there was some general knowledge about what went on here. There were a number of official reports, but those reports are conflicting because people see what they want to see, or writing reports afterwards, they write it from their own perspective, of course, also to make themselves look good. You don't make yourself look bad when you're writing a report. So you have to analyze those reports and come to a consensus. And even we disagreed on what happened in certain aspects, but it's a consensus. You get the best knowledge available and figure, to our minds, this is what happened. And that's really all you can do, because we weren't there, so we never really will know. All we can do is take the best sources available, the best minds available, and come up with a consensus.
By spending a whole lifetime on these topics as you have, how close do you get emotionally to the actual event? I mean, at some points, do you feel like because I know you do battle recreations yourself, don't you?
I do, and as far as the Battle of Lake Erie, my research started out with the people, taking the prize list and finding out who were the soldiers, who were the seamen, who were the Marines, going to the National Archives, going to state historical societies, county historical societies, local historical societies, digging into the lives of these men until the point where somebody writes about the Battle of Lake Erie, asks me about a person. It's like, I know that person. And I can relate to that person, and I feel for that person. And that is my goal in any case, is to make sure that the men who fought these battles are not forgotten. So I have a very deep feeling for the people who were there.
Writing what you've written, that's obvious, because you focus on individuals and groups of people who fought in wars, but you do impart that feeling of, well, this is what these guys were really like. This is what they were feeling on that day.
And what they did, and more than anything, what they suffered. Because these guys, they went through hell. I mean, they literally did. To be on the deck of one of those gunboats, or on the flagship Lawrence, or on the flagship Saratoga, and to see that carnage, and to have to fight through that, and to see your friends literally pulped beside you. I mean, you can't think about that and know something like that without feeling that right in your heart that these guys went through hell. And we can't understand that. We weren't there. You can never understand it unless you were there. But we have to try to make people today, to the extent possible, under the circumstances with what we're dealing with, make people know, make them feel what these men went through. So, I mean, that's the whole thing. You learn from history, and war is hell, and let's make sure we don't do it again. So tell it like it is. You have to tell it like it is. You can't glorify it. You gotta, if it's blood and guts, then you don't want to glorify it. You don't want gratuitous violence, but war is not gratuitous violence. War is war, and you tell it like it happened.
Yeah, war is war. Boy, you've really that says a great deal. And doesn't it make you feel good when you can work with an audience? I almost said work an audience, but you've done it so many times with college students, with little kids in classrooms. It's got to please you when you finish your presentation and I think I got something through to these people.
Well, among our genre of reenactors or interpreters or educators, whatever you want to call us, when you go through a day of reenacting, or you go out and talk to a group, the saying is, if you left leaving one person with an interest to research more, to read more, then you've accomplished your purpose. You've reached somebody, and that's the whole goal of this, is to reach somebody. We're not out here to shoot guns or to have fun. That's part of it. I mean, that's all part of reenacting and part of interpreting, but it's the educational value of what you're doing. You're trying to reach people and educate them into the history of what went on.
And Jerry, you know the names. You've already said that. You know the names of most of the people who were involved on these ships and these battles. Has it ever happened when you were giving a presentation when somebody stands up when it's over and says, I think that guy was related to me?
That happened to me very nastily one time, where there was a Marine named James Byrd who was on the Lake Erie fleet, and he said, yeah, he was my relative. I said, oh, really? He said, yeah, he was wounded. They wrote a poem with him. He fought in the Battle of New Orleans. I said, oh, really? That's what you read? And she said, yeah, we've got the whole family history. And I had to say, well, actually, he never fought in the Battle of New Orleans, because after the Battle of Lake Erie, he actually deserted. He was captured, and he was hung by the Navy at Erie, Pennsylvania. So you burst a few bubbles there. So this can have some drawbacks to it too. Most of them are positive, but every once in a while you run into something like that. So that was a little embarrassing.
That's like the Antiques Roadshow, where the guy brings what he thinks is a 300-year-old rifle in, and the guy says, no, I think that was probably made about 1997.
Right, reproduction, yeah.
Or that beautiful vase is made out of plastic. Well, yeah, I can understand where that could happen, but what I'm trying to say is the interest would be even more poignant, I'm sure, for people who, watching that presentation, heard a name that was familiar and inspired them not only to learn about the battle you're talking about, but to check into their genealogy and find out really if that could be true.
Well, it happens in every audience you talk to, whether it's in northern Ohio or even here in Plattsburgh, because McDonough recruited locally. Yeah. He took local people and recruited them onto the fleet. So when you sit there, you say, well, I'm talking about real people, but I could also be talking about your ancestors, because a lot of these men were recruited right here. We could be dealing with your great-great-great-grandfather right now, and you might not even know it. So you have to personalize it, and that's the whole, if you can personalize it, give people that vested interest, it becomes much more involving for them, and that's what you have to try to do when you are educating and interpreting.
Now, you've written a lot of books and publications. How many at last count?
Wrote 3 books, co-authored a 4th, and a number of papers and articles in historical publications and journals, maybe 8, 10, something like that, and a lot of newspaper articles and odds and ends.
Besides this, and I know you're very much involved in this project, are you got anything else going on?
I'm currently, there's the Council on America's Military Past is doing a conference in May right over here in Burlington. It's the national conference. I'm doing a paper on that for them on command and control on Lake Erie, the Battle of Lake Erie. And I've got another, I've got an idea for a book in mind I want to start after that.
But these two battles are, even though they're part of the same war, they're apples and oranges, aren't they?
They really are, because this one was one of the ones that ended the war. The Battle of Lake Erie was a staying action. It was a major victory. It was one of the first big victories of the war. It gave the United States a bargaining chip at the peace treaty at Ghent, but it was this victory here which really convinced the British that let's give it up. We're fighting a useless battle. This could go on and on. We're emptying our coffers. We're bleeding ourselves white. We know they're going to fight us. Let's end it. And that's what this battle did.
Jerry, thanks so much for being with us again. I know you have a lot of work to do today, but we'll talk to you again before you leave.
Thank you very much, and I'm really pleased to be here. It's been a great experience.
And now that we've laid the groundwork, you have the good fortune of listening to this speech, which we've all been waiting for, with Jerry Althoff, talking about the Battle of Lake Erie and how the war was in the Northwest. Enjoy.
Presentation on the War of 1812 in the Old Northwest, and I'd like to introduce Jerry Althoff, who is a chief ranger historian, right?
Mm-hmm.
At Perry's Victory and International Memorial in Bay, Ohio. And Jerry's kind of been on the fringes the past few months. He and I have talked on the phone several times initially just to kind of network information. And Jerry is part of the Motion Project, and he's working on the mural Battle of Plattsburgh, because Dean is here this week and Jerry volunteered to come back and give us a presentation on the War of 1812 in the Old Northwest. So I'd like to present Jerry Althoff, and he's a member of the National Park Service. What lights? I'll get him in a second. Okay, member of the National Park Service, and I'd like to introduce Jerry Althoff.
Might want to save that and see if it's worthwhile. I'd like to start out by thanking Pat and actually all of you for the opportunity to be here tonight. As was mentioned, I do work for the National Park Service. That makes me a very low-level federal bureaucrat, and as such, I spend most of my time sitting behind a desk pushing paper. So it's any time I get a chance to get out from behind that desk, talk about the War of 1812, it does make it a good day for me. So I am genuinely glad to be here. Can we maybe get those doors, Pat? Because it's just shining in. Okay, one thing I do want to do before we get started, I do wish to advise you about one thing. I have been criticized on occasions for being somewhat graphic in my descriptions of the Battle of Lake Erie. And I will readily admit to that. Some of the things you're going to hear tonight are not very pretty, because after all, we all are talking about war. And war is not bands playing and flags flying and long lines of armies marching on parade. War is nothing but mud and blood and pain and misery and killing. I often do this program for school groups, and one of the last things I want to do is leave any school kid with the impression there's anything glorious about war, because there's no such thing as glory in war. I mean, 20 years later, you get a bunch of veterans together at a reunion, you know, hoisting a few, talking over old times. You might call that glory, I'm not really sure. But there's certainly no such thing as glory in veterans' hospitals, and obviously there's no such thing as glory in veterans' cemeteries. So as I say, some of the things are not going to be very pretty, but it's not gratuitous violence, because we're talking about real people. These are real men who fought real battle, who died horrible deaths, suffered horrible wounds, and lived with horrible memories for the rest of their lives. And the reason I like to tell it like it is to make sure that these men are not forgotten. So, Battle of Lake Erie, war in the Old Northwest. Now, I think it's fairly safe to say that the War of 1812 is one of the least known of all of America's wars. Now, pick up a history book, particularly a school textbook these days, and open it to the War of 1812 section. And that's assuming you can find a War of 1812 section. And what are you going to read about? You're going to read about the Battle of Lake Champlain. You read about the Battle of Lake Erie, the bombardment of Fort McHenry, the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner, or maybe the Battle of New Orleans. Now, you hear about those engagements because the United States won those battles. But I'd venture to say there's not too many people sitting here tonight that have heard of places like Chrysler's Farm, Stony Creek, Queenston Heights, St. David's, Beaver Dams, Cook's Mills, the River Raisin, Bladensburg, Fort Mims, Fort Boyer, Fort Dearborn, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Detroit, Fort Niagara. Now, you don't hear about those engagements because the United States lost those battles. In fact, the United States lost most of the battles of the War of 1812, and that's something our history books don't like to talk about. In fact, it's often said that the United States never lost a war until Vietnam. That is not true. The United States did not win the War of 1812. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say that we lost it, but I will categorically state we did not win it. And I'll prove it. A bit of an oversimplification, but look at it this way. The primary military objective of the United States during the War of 1812 was to capture and annex Canada. The major military objective of Great Britain was to retain Canada as a British colony. Is Canada part of the United States? Who won the War of 1812? Now, we also know the United States is not an aggressor nation. We don't declare war on people, right? Wrong. The United States declared war on Great Britain on June 18, 1812. And it wasn't a very bright thing for the United States to do. A brief comparison here. At the beginning of the War of 1812, Great Britain had an army of more than 250,000 men. At the beginning of 1812, the United States Army comprised fewer than 7,000 men. Great Britain had a navy, the greatest navy in the world, more than 650 warships, and of that number, more than 100 were big two-decker 74-gun line of battleships. The United States had a grand total of 17 ocean-going warships, and we declared war on them. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? That's like any one of you going down to New York City, going up to the entire New York Jets football team and saying, "Let's fight." It wouldn't be a very smart thing to do, except you got lucky because when you walked into the locker room, most of the team was down in Miami playing the Dolphins. The only thing you had left there were two guys on injured reserve, and that's what happened to the United States because most of the British troops in Canada are over fighting in Spain against Napoleonic troops. So very few British troops in Canada. Population-wise, the United States outnumbered Canada by over 10 to 1. Most of the population of Upper Canada, which is present-day Ontario, more than 50% were actually American-born. They had gone over to Upper Canada looking for cheaper free land, and the political faction in Congress, known as the Warhawks, secretly believed that Canada wanted to be part of the United States. So the cry in Congress became, on to Canada. Problem was, somebody forgot to tell the Canadians about that. But in any case, as I say, we declared war on Great Britain on June 18, 1812. So we declared war. Now, how are we going to fight this war? I mean, we couldn't invade Great Britain. It's a continent away. We didn't have the army. We didn't have the navy. But there, just to the north of us, sat Canada. And as I say, we had our eyes on Canada ever since the Revolutionary War. I mean, we tried to capture it unsuccessfully during the Revolution. So now we're going to try it again. And we would invade Canada through 3 separate routes. The first of those would be the old traditional invasion route from the Revolutionary War, through upstate New York, through the Lake Champlain area, across the St. Lawrence River, capture Montreal, the capital of Canada. The second would be across the Niagara River. The objective here would be Fort George and Fort Erie, the British bastions on either end of that river. And finally, the last invasion would be along western Lake Erie. The objective would be Fort Malden and the Amherstburg Navy Yard, which was the major British base on Lake Erie. Now, even before war was declared, the United States knew it was going to happen. So President James Madison called General William Hull back to Washington, D.C. Now, Hull was the governor of Michigan Territory. He had been an officer in the Revolutionary War, but now he was 59 years old, and he knew his own limitations. He was not a very good military officer. Hull knew it. But Madison wanted Hull to raise an army to invade Canada. Hull tried to get out of it, but Madison persuaded him. So in the early spring of 1812, Hull raised an army of about 2,500 men at Dayton, Ohio. And finally, in late spring, even before war was declared, he started marching north. Now, it was a very difficult march through the wilderness. Hull had to cut his own road, build his own bridges, and build blockhouses to protect his supply line. So that by the time the army reached the rapids of the Maumee River, just south of present-day Toledo, Ohio, they were pretty well worn out. So Hull sat to rest for a while. And as he was resting, he encountered the small army supply schooner called the Cuyahoga. Now, what Hull did, or unknown to Hull, what his son did, who was his aide, placed all of Hull's muster rolls and all of his battle plans on board that ship, and it went up towards Detroit. Now, in the meantime, war was declared. And of course, once war was declared, in Canada, they sent an express rider out to Fort Malden. The United States, the Secretary of War, dropped a letter in the mail and said when Hull gets it, he gets it. So the British found out about the declaration of war before the United States did. And sure enough, as that little schooner was passing the narrow ship channel up between Boblo Island and Amherstburg, the Cuyahoga was captured. So here at the outset of the campaign, the British knew more about Hull's army than Hull himself did. But Hull was undeterred. He marched northward, up on the west bank of the river, all the way up to Fort Detroit. Now, Hull had 2,500 men. He outnumbered the British by almost 4 to 1. Now, the British did have about 500 Indians with them, but as most American soldiers knew, Indians were cowards. I mean, after all, Indians would hide behind trees to shoot at you. You know, they would use available cover. They'd shoot and scoot. They would, you know, and if the odds were against them, the Indians wouldn't fight. I mean, that's just not the way you fought back in those days. If you're going to stand out in the open and try to kill your enemy, the least you can do is, you know, stand there, give him a fighting chance to kill you back. That's just the way you fought battles. You know, 125 years later, we figured out maybe the Indians have something there, but in 1813, we didn't look at it that way. So most Americans discounted Indians as fighters. So Hull had that huge numerical superiority. So Hull crossed the Detroit River, and all he then had to do was march about another 18 miles south, surround Fort Malden, and wait for the British to surrender. Now, as Hull was marching south, he ran into a small British outpost at the Oakenard River, 3 miles north of Fort Malden. The British put up a stout resistance, but they were heavily outnumbered. The Americans outflanked them, forced the British to retreat. Hull now had only 3 more miles to go. The campaign would be over. Except it didn't quite happen that way. Instead, Hull marched back up the Sandwich, recrossed the river, took his whole army back inside Fort Detroit, proceeded to bury his head in the sand and do absolutely nothing. Now, in the interim while this was going on, Fort Michilimackinac at the tip of Michigan was captured by the British. And the British officer who captured it, a Captain Roberts, sent a message down to Fort Malden. And that message said that there were 5,000 Indian reinforcements on their way down to help the British. Well, there probably weren't 5,000 Indians under arms in the entire Northwest and probably in all of North America. The captain who sent that message knew that, but Hall did not. It was sent for one and only one purpose, to be captured, and it was. And when Hall captured that message, the one man in that whole army who was deathly afraid of Indians was General William Hall. And because of that, he retreated back up into Detroit. Well, shortly after that, Major General Isaac Brock, the Lieutenant Governor General of Canada, brought reinforcements out to Fort Malden. Now, without doubt, Brock was the best general officer the British had in North America at this point in time, a very aggressive officer. And even with those reinforcements, the British were still outnumbered by more than 2 to 1. But Brock was not the man to sit around and do nothing. Even though outnumbered, he took his forces, crossed the Detroit River, marched north, surrounded Fort Detroit, and opened fire. And on August 16, 1812, without firing a shot, General William Hall surrendered the entire Northwest Army. 2,500 men, 39 cannons, and a mountain of supplies. So here was the war that the United States declared. An invasion the United States initiated, the whole army was wiped out in one fell swoop. Well, fortunately for the United States, immediately after this disaster, General William Henry Harrison was assigned to command the army in the Old Northwest. And Harrison started raising another army for another invasion of Canada. But because of logistical difficulties, Harrison divided his army into 2 separate wings. One he placed at Upper Sandusky, Ohio, just out of the side of the map here, and the other at Fort Wayne, Indiana. The plan was to raise troops, get enough supplies, have both wings of the army march to the rapids of the Maumee River, where they would join forces and invade Canada. Well, by late December, they were ready to go. And Harrison gave Major General James Winchester, who was in command at Fort Wayne, the orders to move. And Winchester starts marching towards the rapids of the Maumee. Now, Winchester reached the rapids before Harrison did. And as he was waiting for Harrison, a few settlers from Frenchtown, present-day Monroe, Michigan, came marching down to Winchester and said, "The Indians are raiding the town. Would you help us?" And Winchester said, "Sure." Now, he had a small army of only about 1,000 men, but he took 550 of those men up to the River Raisin at Frenchtown. And there, in a gallant bayonet assault, he easily pushed the small force of British and Indians out of Frenchtown. But now, instead of taking those 550 men back to the rapids to wait for Harrison, he instead brought almost the remainder of his army up to Frenchtown. And here it happened once again. Winchester sat and did absolutely nothing. He didn't dig any trenches. He didn't put out any pickets. In fact, he placed his own headquarters and the reserve ammunition supply on the opposite side of the river from where the main army was. And sure enough, 3 days later, a reinforced British and Indian army attacked Winchester's lines along the River Raisin. Immediately on the right flank of the Americans, the British and Indians hit them, the regulars. The regulars, surprised in the dawn, broke and ran. The Indians got in among them and tomahawked and scalped about 150 of them. But the Americans, all the way on the left flank, in the town of Frenchtown itself, beat back 3 separate British attacks, until finally they saw a British officer coming up to the gate of the town with a white flag. Now, the commander in the town of the militia, Major George Madison, figured the British were going to ask for a truce to bury the dead and pick up the wounded. Again, it didn't happen that way, because early in the engagement, Winchester himself was captured. And even though half the army has defeated the British, Winchester surrendered the entire army. Now, Madison had to do a little bit of thinking here. He had beaten the British back, but he was short on ammunition. He wasn't going to be getting any more reinforcements, so maybe he'd better surrender. But before he did so, he was worried about the Indians. So he extracted a promise from British Colonel Proctor. "Sure, I'll surrender, but I want you to protect me from the Indians." Proctor gave him his promise, and George Madison surrendered. Well, immediately after the battle ended, Proctor took the wounded British, the unwounded, of course, all the British Army, and the unwounded American prisoners back across the ice over to Fort Malden. But they left the American wounded in Frenchtown. And the next morning, the Potawatomi Indians came in and took those who were ambulatory and took them as slaves. Those who could not, the cabins were set on fire, and the wounded who tried to crawl out were killed and scalped. Roughly 65 wounded American prisoners were massacred by the Indians. Now, what most Americans forget is the fact that the Potawatomis were doing this in retribution for having their homes and crops burned by the Americans about 6 weeks before. Most Americans, though, discounted that. 65 American prisoners were massacred. And this later gave rise to the cry, "Remember the Raisin." Just like in later wars, remember the Alamo, remember the Maine, remember Pearl Harbor. Well, in 1813, it became "Remember the Raisin." It made Americans mad, and it made the Kentuckians in particular willing to fight. But this didn't help William Henry Harrison because he just lost half of his army. So Harrison now had a choice. He could retreat all the way back to Franklinton, present-day Columbus, Ohio, or he could build an advanced supply base along the northern frontier, and that's what he decided to do. So throughout the spring months, late winter and early spring of 1813, a very large fort was built at the rapids of the Maumee River, almost 8 acres in size, and eventually it was named in honor of Ohio's governor, returned Jonathan Meigs, and Fort Meigs came into being. So by the spring of 1813, Harrison had himself a brand new, very strong bastion. But now at a point in time, in the spring, when Harrison needed anywhere between 5,000 and 10,000 men to garrison Fort Meigs and all the other posts in the Old Northwest, well, he started to run into a problem because most of his militiamen had to go home. They had to plant their crops because if these men didn't plant their crops, their families were going to starve. Certainly no supermarkets where they could go to, so these men just up and went home. Now Harrison was down to fewer than 1,000 men. And when the British found out about that, they embarked their army and artillery on board their ships, left Amherstburg, sailed across the lake, up the Maumee River. There, they disembarked their cannon, surrounded Fort Meigs, and opened fire. For 5 days, the British bombarded Fort Meigs, hoping to drive the Americans out, until finally, on May 4th, a white flag was sent up to the gates of Fort Meigs. They were asking Harrison to surrender. Harrison turned them down because Harrison had an ace in the hole. Unknown to the British and their vaunted Indian allies, 1,200 Kentucky reinforcements at that very moment had reached a spot only 1 mile below Fort Meigs. Harrison wasn't going to surrender. Harrison was going to attack. So he planned the assault to take place at dawn on the morning of May 5th. Now what was going to happen was what 800 men under the command of Lieutenant Colonel William Dudley was going to attack up the left bank of Fort Meigs. They were to capture the 2 British batteries, spike the guns so they couldn't be used, and then retreat across the river back into Fort Meigs. The other 400 men under the command of General Green Clay would land below on the right bank, fight through the Indians, and make their way into the fort. It was a wonderful scheme, and at dawn on the morning of May 5th, the order was given. The assault began, and it worked perfectly. The British were completely surprised. The Americans captured the guns almost without firing a shot. And then the plan fell apart. For some reason, and nobody really knows why, maybe the orders were garbled in transmission, maybe they were never received, but the guns were not all spiked, and the Americans, once they captured the guns, did not retreat across the river into the fort. They just mingled about the guns, enjoying their brief success. Until about after a half an hour, they saw a few Indians in the woods up ahead of them. And an Indian to a Kentucky militiaman, it's like waving a red flag in front of a bull. These men had an implacable hatred for each other. Kentuckians and Indians had been fighting themselves for over 50 years. And when the Kentuckians saw those Indians, they lost all organization and went charging into the woods after them, which is exactly what the Indians wanted. Because in that half-hour interval, British reinforcements came down from their main camp. They had laid a well-placed trap, and the Americans charged right into it. Of the 800 American soldiers who went up the left bank of that river, less than 150 of them managed to get back to Fort Meigs. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured by the British and Indians. However, the 400 men on the right bank of the river did manage to fight their way into the fort, and this was sufficient. The British kept up the siege for another week, but they were unable to crack the nut of Fort Meigs. And after 2 weeks, the British gave up and retreated back into Canada. However, in late July, the British tried it again. Once again, they came down up the Maumee River, surrounded Fort Meigs, and were hoping to get it to surrender. But they knew they were going to have to get the Americans out of the fort. They tried to bombard it once. It didn't work. They were going to have to get the American soldiers out of the fort. So this time Tecumseh, the great Shawnee chief, came up with a plan. What they would do was stage a mock battle in the woods on the road between Fort Meigs and Upper Sandusky, where the main army was with Harrison. General Green Clay was now commanding the fort. The plan was they would stage the battle out of sight of the fort, and the Americans in the fort would think reinforcements were coming. They would all rush outside of the fort to help their comrades, and there the Indians would ambush them. And the mock battle started. Every man in the fort grabbed his musket and ran for the gate. They all clamored to have the gates open so they could rush out and help their friends, except for one man, and that was General Green Clay. Clay had not heard of any reinforcements coming up. Clay suspected it was a trap. So even though every man in the fort tried to get out, Clay refused to open the gates. And after a half hour, a thunderstorm broke, and when the Indians' powder got wet, the battle fizzled out, and it was a miserable failure. The second siege of Fort Meigs was also unsuccessful. But now, instead of retreating directly back to Canada, General Proctor knew he was going to have to do something. He had all these Indians as allies. Of course, the Indians were fighting for their homes, but they were also fighting for plunder. And they had no success for the last 2 or 3 months, not since they had the success over at the River Raisin. So Proctor had to find some type of easy victory to placate the Indians. So what he decided to do now was attack Fort Stephenson at present-day Fremont, Ohio. The Indians went overland while the British took across the lake, came up Sandusky Bay, up the Sandusky River, and there they surrounded Fort Stephenson. Now, Fort Stephenson was a very small post, only 1 acre in size, garrisoned by 160 men, commanded by a 21-year-old major in the 17th U.S. Infantry, George Crowan. So Proctor figured this would be an easy victory for the British and the Indians. So on August 1st, they opened fire, and they bombarded the fort all night long. Now, Crowan had only 1 cannon, a single 6-pounder in the fort, and he kept moving it around to the different blockhouses to try to fool the British. But the next morning, he noticed as the morning progressed, the British were concentrating their fire on the northwest angle of the fort. And Crowan suspected correctly that this is where the British would make their assault. So what he did was he took that single cannon, put it in the northern blockhouse, masked it so the British could not see it, and he aimed it right down along the ditch where he felt the British were going to make the attack. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon of August 2nd, 400 regulars, the 41st Regiment of Foot, in 3 long lines advanced against Fort Meigs. As they came closer, the Americans within musket range opened fire. The British troops started falling. They wavered for a minute, but their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Short, rallied them. They pressed forward until finally they reached the ditch fronting the fort. And there the first line jumped into the ditch. The men with the axes, the pioneers, started hacking at the walls. But Crowan waited until the second line also reached the ditch and jumped into it, and then he unmasked his single 6-pounder, loaded to the muzzle, double charge of canister, and then crammed full of old bits of iron, nails, and glass. This first shot cut a bloody swath through those jam-packed redcoats in the ditch. And then finally it took only 1 more round, which cut down many more of those brave British soldiers, until finally those left in the ditch to survive decided to play dead. The British, at nightfall, finally crawled away. The British suffered more than 100 casualties, over 25% of the attacking force. George Crowan lost 1 man killed and 6 wounded. A disaster for the British. British General Proctor would later say that enough British blood has been shed to satisfy even the Indians. The British again retreated back into Canada. So as the situation now stood in the late summer of 1813, the United States had tried to invade Canada twice. They had failed. The British had tried to invade the United States twice. They had failed. There was one thing, one factor, which would now determine the outcome of the war in the Old Northwest, and that was Lake Erie. Because in 1813, there was almost no roads in that neck of the woods. For an army to march from Cleveland, Ohio, all the way up to Detroit, Michigan, could take as long as 3 to 4 weeks, because all of Northwest Ohio at that point in time was one great big swamp. And as usual that summer, I-75 was under construction. So it took a long time for an army to march up to Detroit, Michigan. But by ship you could cover that same distance in only 2 or 3 days. So whoever held naval control could easily move men and supplies back and forth. And at the outset of the War of 1812, Great Britain had 6 warships on Lake Erie. The United States had 1. And that one lone warship was captured at Detroit at the very beginning of the war. So for the whole first year of the War of 1812, Great Britain maintained naval control over Lake Erie. Now, I'm going to back up for a moment here. Talked a little bit a while ago about the capture of Mackinac at the beginning of the war. And when Mackinac was captured, there was a man who happened to be up there who was at the wrong place at the wrong time. And that was Daniel Dobbins. Now, Dobbins was the commander of a small merchant vessel cruising the upper lakes. And he just happened to be anchored at Mackinac when it was captured by the British. And his ship was included in the surrender terms. But the British at Mackinac were not able to take care of all of those prisoners, so what they did was they made Dobbins' vessel a cartel ship, or a truce ship. They placed all the prisoners on board, sent them down to Detroit, paroling them, saying not to fight until they're properly paroled. So Dobbins was sent down to Detroit. And he arrived at Detroit just in time to get captured a second time when Detroit fell. But Dobbins managed to escape, made it all the way back to Erie, Pennsylvania. From there, he was sent back to Washington, D.C. So it was Daniel Dobbins who was the first man to inform President James Madison of the disaster up at Detroit. And Dobbins managed to convince the President and the Cabinet that the only way the United States was going to be able to compete for control of Lake Erie is if we had warships. The President agreed. Dobbins was commissioned a sailing master in the U.S. Navy and told to go build a fleet of warships. And to do that, the government gave him $2,000. Well, amazingly enough, Dobbins proceeded to do precisely what he was ordered. Now, the first thing he had to do was find a place to build these ships. And that location he selected was Erie, Pennsylvania. Erie was a perfect place to build ships. It had this natural protected harbor, protected on the north and northwest by Presque Isle Peninsula and on the south by the Pennsylvania mainland. But more importantly, it had a very narrow channel entrance coming into the harbor itself. And when that channel entrance could be protected by blockhouses on either side. What this meant was if the British later came down to blockade the harbor or destroy the ships as they were being built, which they did, well, they wouldn't be able to get into the harbor because of that narrow channel entrance. So Dobbins picked the perfect place to build ships. It was also his hometown, so it was a good place for him to build ships too. So he had ulterior motives. But in any case, in late September of 1812, Daniel Dobbins started building 4 small gunboats at Erie, Pennsylvania. Construction went fairly well until the last day of the year. And on that day, December 31st, Erie received a special visitor. And that was Commodore Isaac Chauncey. Now, Chauncey was the overall commander of Great Lakes Naval Operations. He was based out of Sackett's Harbor up on Lake Ontario. But he wanted to visit his command and see how things were going on Lake Erie. And when he saw these 4 small gunboats, he knew that they were not going to be big enough to fight the British for control of the lake. So he now authorized Dobbins to build a bigger vessel, a 20-gun brig. Eventually, this order would be expanded to include 2 20-gun brigs. Things were pretty much under control. Dobbins headed back to Lake Ontario. But on the way back, he had to do some thinking here. He had this brand new fleet being constructed at Erie, but he didn't have anybody to command it. Now, the officers he had on Lake Erie and Lake Ontario didn't have the seniority, didn't have the training, didn't have the experience. And this was on his mind when he arrived back at Sackett's Harbor. But as he pulled into Sackett's Harbor, there was a letter waiting for him there. Chauncey needed a commander for this fleet, and 27-year-old Master Commandant Oliver Hazard Perry was yearning for just such an opportunity. Now, Perry's career up to this time had been anything but spectacular. He went to sea at age 13 on board a ship commanded by his own father. Now, if you're going to be a midshipman in the Navy, before the days of the Naval Academy, you had to have influence. You had to know somebody. And in 1798, the frigate, General Greene, was fitting out to fight against France in the Quasi-War. And one of the young men that the commander of that ship, Captain Christopher Perry, chose to be a midshipman was his own son. So that's how Perry ended up in the United States Navy, and along with his 4 brothers. They had influence, and that's what you had to have. So Perry fought through the Quasi-War with France and against the Barbary pirates in the Tripolitan Wars, but he didn't really see a whole lot of action. When war was declared in 1812, Perry was in command of a small fleet of gunboats at Newport, Rhode Island. Now, these were Jeffersonian gunboats, basically rowboats with a single cannon on it. This was the United States Navy's idea of how we were going to fight the British Navy if we ever went to war, gunboats with a single cannon on them. So this was not a very distinguished command for Perry. So during the first months of the war, there sat Perry at Newport, while his friends are out in the oceans on ships like the Constitution, the United States, the Hornet, the Wasp, the Essex, gaining glory, if you want to call it glory, and there sat Perry rotting in a backwater of the war. Now, Perry wanted command of one of these fast sloops of war, so he sent a letter to the Secretary of the Navy. The Secretary turned him down. 2 months later, he tried again. Again, the Secretary turned him down. Not enough ships, too many commanders. So now Perry did something he really didn't want to do. Perry wanted to get into this war. The only way you gained recognition was basically through peer recognition, and the so-called glory and promotion was through victory in battle, and Perry desperately wanted it. And if he had to go to Lake Erie to gain that glory, then so be it. So Oliver Hazard Perry didn't want to go to Lake Erie. It was his last desperate gamble to get into this war, to fight against the British, and to gain that glory that he so desperately sought. And as I say, if he had to go to Lake Erie to do it, then that's what he would do. So Perry arrived at Erie, Pennsylvania in late March of 1813, and there he channeled all of his energies into completing this new fleet, which, if you stop to think about it, was going to take a heck of a lot of work because there's absolutely nothing at Erie, Pennsylvania to build ships with, except wood. I mean, there's virgin timber all over the place. But to build a ship, you have to chop down a tree, carve it up, and you let that wood cure for about a year. Except these men didn't have a year. So what was a nice live green tree one morning might become part of a deck plank, a stanchion, or a yardarm that very afternoon. Everything else had to be hauled in from the outside. Canvas and cordage from Pittsburgh, powder from Philadelphia, guns from New York City and Washington, D.C. And all of this material had to be hauled over horrible roads in one of the worst winters in memory. One of the miracles of the Battle of Lake Erie is not the fact that the United States won this engagement, but the fact that a fleet of 6 ships was built out in the wilderness in a period of less than 8 months' time. For that feat alone, Oliver Hazard Perry and Daniel Dobbins deserve tremendous credit. So by late July of 1813, Perry had 6 ships built at Erie, Pennsylvania. Now, altogether, though, he had a total of 11 vessels, because 5 more small gunboats were brought down from Black Rock, New York. Now, Black Rock was a very small naval station just a mile or 2 north of Buffalo. And what the government did at the beginning of the war, they bought up all the merchant ships on the lake. You take a small merchant schooner, you beef up the bow, you put a cannon on it, you have a gunboat. Not much of a gunboat, but you have a gunboat. So now with these 5 extra gunboats, Perry had 11 vessels, and by late July he was ready to sail. Except for one very big problem. Perry didn't have enough men to man this fleet. Now, Perry was in agreement with his superior, Isaac Chauncey, and the Secretary of the Navy that the crew of these 11 vessels, he needed more than 740 men. By mid-July, Perry had only 120 men fit for duty, not even enough to crew his own flagship. Now, Perry knew he needed men. He knew that back as early as May, and he'd written a letter to Chauncey asking for reinforcements. Chauncey ignored him. 2 weeks later, Perry wrote another letter asking for reinforcements. Again, Chauncey ignored him. Now, Chauncey up on Lake Ontario had his own fleet to crew, and the British on Lake Ontario to fight, and he was very reluctant to send men down to Lake Erie, and he didn't. And of course, Chauncey had the responsibility for all the lakes, and he was responsible to send men to each of those lakes, and Lake Erie at this point in time was the second most important station next to Lake Ontario. So Chauncey was supposed to send men to Lake Erie, he just simply did not do it. Perry then made a big mistake. He bypassed his immediate superior and wrote a letter directly to the Secretary of the Navy. Now, the Secretary of the Navy gets this letter and says, "Why is Perry writing to me?" So he writes a letter to Chauncey and asks what's going on. Of course, when Chauncey found out what Perry did, he became highly irate, and he writes a nasty letter to Perry. Perry's not to take anything from Chauncey. He writes a nasty letter back. And pretty soon you have this acrimonious correspondence going back and forth between Perry and Chauncey. It eventually became so bad that Perry resigned his command on Lake Erie. But in the meantime, one thing that letter did, it broke the logjam of seamen. and several drafts of seamen were finally sent down to Lake Erie. Still not enough of what Perry needed. So what Perry did now was set up a recruiting station on land. Now, Erie was just a backwoods town of only about 200 people, not a very fertile recruiting ground. But an entire regiment of Pennsylvania militia had been sent to Erie to guard the fleet as it was being built. So about 65 of these militiamen joined the Navy, another 35 or so joined the U.S. Marine Corps. So now Perry, by early August, had about 400 men. Again, still not enough to man all of his vessels, but he knew he would not be getting further reinforcements from Lake Ontario. So on August 12th, Perry hoisted up his anchors and pointed his bowsprits towards Lake Erie, western Lake Erie. Of course, there was that minor matter of his resignation. Of course, Perry sent that in on August 10th, and he sailed 2 days later. Now, Perry knew it was going to take time to act on that letter. He also knew he put in a lot of effort getting this fleet built and a lot of effort getting this fleet manned. And now when it came time to fight this fleet, he wasn't going to pass up that opportunity. He had sent that letter in, but he was still going to make the most of the time he had left. So he did head for western Lake Erie. Now, Perry rendezvoused with William Henry Harrison 4 days later at Sandusky Bay. And when Harrison found out Perry was short of sailors, he asked for volunteers from the Army, and another 130 men from the regiments in the Old Northwest volunteered to join the fleet. So really, what you had in the end result of the roughly 550 men who fought on board this squadron, more than 40% of them weren't even sailors. They were soldiers and Marines from more than 20 different military units in the Lake Ontario and Lake Erie regions. An incredible amalgamation of men who never before, never since joined together to fight a fleet of U.S. warships. So now, having his final reinforcement, Perry sailed over to Put-in-Bay to make it his base. Put-in-Bay, one of the islands among the Lake Erie Islands. But Perry did make 2 reconnaissance cruises up to Fort Malden, but he decided not to make a direct attack. The fort was too well defended, the channel was too narrow, the current was too swift, the winds were too fickle. And besides, Perry did not have to risk his fleet attacking well-defended Fort Malden. All Perry had to do was sail back down to Put-in-Bay, drop anchors, train his hybrid crews, and wait. Because Perry knew as long as he was sitting at Put-in-Bay, the next move was going to be up to the British. Now, the British fleet was commanded by Robert Harriet Barclay, a veteran Royal Navy officer who, though, was actually a year younger than Perry. Barclay went to sea at age 12, served with Lord Nelson at the historic Battle of Trafalgar, and 2 years later, in 1807, he lost an arm fighting against the French. But the British needed every officer it had, fighting for their very lives. Even though Barclay was an invalid, the British Navy still needed him. And barely recuperated, he was shipped over to North America, eventually to Lake Ontario, finally out to Lake Erie. Now, Barclay also didn't want to be on Lake Erie. In fact, he was ordered there after another officer, Captain Richard Mulcaster, declined the command, saying there's no glory to be gained on Lake Erie. But one thing Barclay did have, a brand new flagship, the 19-gun Detroit, just completed at the Amherstburg Navy Yard. But many of the supplies and materials for this new flagship simply weren't available. Even the guns that were supposed to line her broadside had been captured by the Americans up on Lake Ontario. So what the British had to do was strip Fort Malden of its heavy guns to put on board the Detroit. Now, normally for a ship of this nature, you want all one battery of heavy guns, say all big, heavy 24-pounders to line your broadside. Problem was, Fort Malden didn't have that many heavy guns. So what Barclay ended up with on the Detroit was 2 24-pounders, 2 18-pounders, several 12-pounders, even smaller 9-pounders, all of which took different sizes of ammunition, all of which would cause Barclay problems later on during the battle. Barclay was also desperately short of sailors, and his fleet was commanded mostly by soldiers of the 41st Regiment of Foot, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, the Provincial Marine, the same as our Merchant Marine, and also the Canadian Militia. But the biggest problem the British had, the biggest problem was Fort Malden itself, because in addition to the British Army, and in addition to the British Navy, there were 14,000 Indians camped around Fort Malden. Of course, the Indians were allied to the British, and they had gathered from all over the Northwest. And of course, they brought their families with them too. There weren't that many fighting men, mostly non-combatants, but they were all there camped around Fort Malden. And the one thing the British had to do to maintain their loyalty was to feed the Indians. And of course, 14,000 mouths took a heck of a lot of food. And this is where the British problem came in, because now Perry was sitting at Put-in-Bay. Now, for the British, very few roads in Upper Canada at this point in time. The only way the British could get additional supplies is if their supply ships sailed from Fort Malden around Point Pelee over to the eastern end of the lake. The problem was Perry was now sitting right in the middle of the Lake Erie Islands. If the British supply ships sailed, all Perry had to do was move about 10 miles north, sit in this area right here, and wait for those ships to come back and capture them. So as long as Perry was at Put-in-Bay, the British supply line was cut off. By September 9th, the British were down to only 1 day's supply of flour, and they faced a cruel choice. The British could either burn Fort Malden and abandon the entire Northwest, or the British fleet could sail down to defeat the American fleet and reopen their supply lines. And that's why the Battle of Lake Erie was fought. So even though Barclay knew his ships were not ready, his men were not trained, he had no choice. He received orders from General Proctor, and on early in the afternoon of September 9th, Barclay slipped his anchors and floated down into western Lake Erie. The British were spotted at dawn in the morning of September 10th, and Perry, with 9 ships, sailed out to fight. Now, Perry started with 11 ships, but one of them he couldn't even man. He had to leave one of the small schooners back at Erie. And another one, the schooner Ohio, sailed back to Erie for supplies a few days before. So Perry was down to 9 vessels, and with those, he sailed out to fight. Now, there's 2 things you have to take into consideration when you're talking about any naval engagement of this time frame. And the first of those are the guns that were used. Now, the British fleet was armed mostly with long guns. That's your standard naval cannon of the day that can fire a cannonball roughly 1 mile, accurately to about a half a mile. But the American fleet was armed with something different. Perry's ships had mostly carronades. Now, the carronade was a fairly recent invention, invented in Carron, Scotland, which is where the name comes from. And the carronade had several advantages over the old traditional long gun. Now, if you take a look at the comparison down here at the bottom, both of those guns are 32-pounders, meaning they fire a 32-pound cannonball. Now, a 32-pounder long gun, just the barrel alone, could be as long as 12 feet long and weigh between 6,000 and 7,000 pounds. Now, what this meant, if you had a small ship, you could either carry one big gun or a lot of small guns. But a small ship could not carry a lot of big guns. Until then came the carronade in the late 1770s. Now, the carronade was only 5 feet long. And even though they both fired the same size cannonball, a 32-pounder carronade, the barrel weighed only 2,000 pounds, less than 1/3 the weight. The carronade took fewer people to operate. You could load it and fire it twice as fast, and it used less than 1/3 the powder, so it was a lot more economical. This was a great gun, had a lot of advantages to it. Also had one very big disadvantage. Because it was so much shorter, and because it used a lot less powder, it had less than half the range of a long gun. In fact, the point-blank range of a 32-pounder carronade was only 330 yards. And because it was a short-range gun, that brings the second factor into play, and that's the wind. Because the 2 biggest ships of each squadron were square-rigged sailing vessels. In other words, the yards were square to the mast and they carried square sails. Now, a square rigger cannot sail directly into the wind, or roughly within an arc of 150 degrees of the wind's direction. These square riggers had to have the wind behind them. So what all this boils down to, if Barclay, the British ships, had the wind behind them, they could sit 1/2 mile away, and with their superiority in long guns, they could pound Perry's ships into submission one by one, and Perry would never even get within range. So it was absolutely crucial for the Americans to have the weather gauge. Perry had to have the wind behind him. And when the American ships pulled out of Put-in-Bay Harbor that morning, Perry was sailing to the west-northwest. The wind was blowing from the west-southwest, almost directly in Perry's face. For the next 3 hours, the American squadron tacked back and forth between Rattlesnake Island and South Bass Island. Now, what Perry was trying to do was get to the west of Rattlesnake. If he could do that, then he could turn north and he could have the wind behind him. But he simply could not do it. His brigs were shallow draft vessels built for fighting in the shallow portion of western Lake Erie and Lake St. Clair. Perry, as he was tacking back and forth, was making as much leeway as he was headway. Finally, at 10 o'clock, Perry gave up. He gave the order to turn around and head the other direction. But miraculously, even before that order could be executed, the wind suddenly backed around 90 degrees and blew out of the southeast, directly behind the American fleet. So the most critical factor in the battle that day was not men, not guns, not ships, not commanders, good old Mother Nature and the wind. And just when the Americans needed it, that wind came around 90 degrees and gave Perry the critical advantage he needed. So with that advantage, he pointed his bowsprits to the northwest, sailed out to engage the British. Now Barclay, he had no choice. With the wind advantage or without it, Barclay had to fight. So he turned his fleet to the westward, hove to in line of battle, and prepared to fight. Now this was the first opportunity that Perry was able to see the entire British battle line. So he now made a few adjustments in his own battle plan. Now he placed two small schooners, the Scorpion and Ariel, off the weather bow of the flagship. These would engage the first British vessel. Third in line came the Lawrence. This was Perry's flagship. Now, Perry was a master commandant. That was his actual rank. But because he commanded a vessel, he was also entitled to the rank of captain. And because he commanded an entire squadron, he was entitled to the rank of a commodore. So all three of those titles are appropriate. But as a commodore, Perry was also entitled to carry his own flag, just like any flag officer. So whatever ship Perry was on, that was the flagship. And Perry chose the Lawrence to be his flagship, the 20-gun brig. The Lawrence would engage the Detroit, Barclay's flagship, with 19 guns. Now, fourth in line came the Caledonia, a small brig. She carried only 3 guns. But fifth in line came the Niagara, another 20-gun brig, and a sister ship of the Lawrence. The Niagara, under Master Commandant Jesse Elliott, would engage the Queen Charlotte, the second largest British ship of 17 guns. And then last came the schooners and sloops. These would engage the smaller British vessels. So altogether, the Americans had 9 vessels, the British had 6. So the Americans outnumbered the British. Well, not quite, because the British with 6 vessels had 63 guns. The Americans with 9 vessels had only 54 guns. So the British outnumbered the Americans. Well, again, not quite, because it wasn't the number of guns or the number of ships that counted here. It was weight of broadsides. Now, let me simplify that. Let's take the Lawrence and say she had 10 guns on one side, and all these guns were 32-pounders. So if all 10 of those guns fired at one time, she'd give her a broadside weight of 320 pounds. So let's say the British had also 10 guns on one side on the Detroit, but they were only 18-pounders. Of course, that would give her a broadside weight of 180 pounds. So, of Perry's 54 cannons, 40 of them were on the Lawrence and Niagara, both 20-gun brigs. And of those 40 guns, 36 of them were those heavy 32-pounder carronades. Now, the largest guns the British had were 24-pounders, and they really didn't have that many of them. So what all this means is, if Perry could get the Lawrence up against the Detroit in close action, if he could get the Niagara up against the Queen Charlotte in close action, Perry would actually have better than a 2-to-1 advantage over the British in weight of broadsides. Now, each commander knew the smaller vessels with only 1 or 2 guns each was not going to play a major role in this battle. All Perry had to do was get the 4 biggest ships together, and if he could do that, he should easily be able to win this battle. Now, just before the battle opened, Perry raised his battle flag to the topmast of the Lawrence. It was a large blue banner with the crudely inscribed words, "Don't give up the ship." Now, a lot of people attribute these words to Perry, but they were not his. These were the dying words of a friend of Perry's, Captain James Lawrence. On June 1st, 1813, Lawrence and his frigate, the Chesapeake, sailed out of Boston Harbor to fight a British ship called the Shannon. Early in the engagement, Lawrence was hit in the lower stomach by a musket ball. As he was carried below decks, he kept uttering over and over again, "Don't give up the ship, fight her till she sinks, blow her up, don't give up the ship." Well, sadly enough, Lawrence's men did give up the ship, and really in record time, less than 15 minutes. In fact, the battle between the Chesapeake and the Shannon was one of the most deplorable battles in all of American naval history. However, we're a young Navy. We didn't have too many good sayings about this time, and when you think about it, "Don't give up the ship" has a negative connotation to it. But even so, Perry used his dead friend's dying words as his battle slogan, and it's also where the name of his flagship came from, the Lawrence. So now, with his battle flag up and fleet ready, Perry moved in to fight. He had the wind behind him, but it was blowing very lightly, and it was going to take another hour for the Americans to close within range. And there was nothing for these men to do now but sit there and wait. Now, the men who had never fought in a naval battle before were blithely ignorant. They had no clue of what was coming. But the men who had been in battle, and many of them had, knew what was coming, and they were worried about it. These men were terrified. A long hour of waiting, and they often say the waiting is the worst part. And for these men it was, because these men knew that a naval battle held more horror and more terror than any land battle ever could. I mean, it just wasn't musket balls or cannonballs that these men were worried about. First of all, they were worried about being raked, because one ship passes in front of another. It's called crossing the T. It crosses right in front at a 90-degree angle, and all the guns on the T, the cross T ship, can fire down the length of the other ship, and the other ship can't even fire back. And a single cannonball can carry death and destruction the entire length of a gun deck packed full of men. And they weren't worried that much about cannonballs. A cannonball crashes straight through the ship. It was the wood splinters, because when a cannonball hit the side of a wooden ship, it shattered. And dozens of wood splinters, anywhere from the size of a fingernail to that of a spear, would scour the deck. They were worried about other things that could belch from the mouth of a smoothbore cannon. In addition to round shot, there was bar shot and chain shot. Bar shot looked like a dumbbell, whereas chain shot was two cannonballs hooked together by a length of chain. Fired from a cannon, it would spin through the air, and it was used against masts, sails, and rigging. Grape shot looks like a bundle of grapes. Gets its name from, but it's actually a three-tiered shot. And on a 32-pound grape shot, it carries 9 smaller 4-pound balls. And canister shot, a tin can filled full of about 50 ping-pong-sized balls. What grape shot and canister shot do is turn a smoothbore cannon into a giant shotgun. And then there was langrage shot, something Perry used a lot of because he was short of ammunition. You take a piece of canvas and sew it into a pocket, and you fill that pocket of canvas full of nails, glass, spare bits of iron, and you sew it up, ram it into a cannon, and fire it out, devastating against personnel. Of course, these men were worried about fire. Muzzle flash from the guns could catch a ship on fire, and if a ship burns out from under you, you have no place to go but into the water. And oddly enough, most of these men had never even learned how to swim. They were worried about masts, yards, rigging, falling from aloft. They were worried about guns overturning, which could crush and maim. They were worried about boarding actions, where one ship would go up or crash into another one, and the crew would board and try to capture that vessel. And you had the personal bloodletting with muskets and bayonets and sabers and cutlasses and boarding pikes, boarding axes, knives, hands and feet, and teeth if necessary. But most of all, what terrified these men was being wounded and being sent down to the dank horror of the orlop deck, where the surgeon waited in his butcher's apron with his bone saws, lancets, scalpels, and probes, and the seaman would have nothing as an anesthetic except a shot of whiskey and a piece of leather to choke off his screams. You often read something in naval fiction to the effect that the decks or the men eagerly waited the coming action. Don't believe it. I mean, they wanted to get it over with, make no mistake about it, but not one of these men, except maybe for one or two officers, were actually eager to fight this battle. But fight it they would, because they were here, they were the ones selected, or they volunteered, and they were the ones who were going to fight. Now, even before the battle opened, Perry started to run into problems, because the smaller schooners bringing up the rear of his line were deep-hulled merchant vessels designed for carrying cargo, not guns, not built as warships. And since the wind was blowing very lightly, these schooners started to lag behind. So that really, when Perry moved into battle, his fleet was divided into 2 wings, with the 4 smaller schooners actually 2 miles behind and completely out of the battle. But Perry wasn't overly concerned about that because, as I said, all he had to do was get the 4 large ships together and he would have that 2-to-1 advantage he needed. Finally, at 11:45, a bugle was heard on board the British flagship, followed by the ship's band playing a rendition of Rule Britannia. And as the final strains of the song echoed across the waters of Lake Erie, a single cannon shot was heard, breaking the silence. a 24-pounder, a ranging shot which splashed harmlessly near the Lawrence. But a few minutes later, the British tried again, and this time a 24-pounder crashed through the bulwarks of the Lawrence, and flying splinters killed and wounded the first American sailors. Now, Perry at this time could not even fire back. Two reasons for this. One, Perry was in the approaching fleet. He was coming up at about a 45-degree angle, and since his guns bore out at 90 degrees, the guns could not bear. But more importantly, those short-range carronades. His guns were not even within range. There was really nothing Perry could do. For a half an hour, Perry set all sail, trying to close within range, passing almost the entire British battle line, suffering punishment all the way, until finally, at 12:15, the Lawrence came up within 300 yards of the flagship Detroit. Then Perry luffed the Lawrence and opened fire with his heavy 32-pounders. The battle was now going Perry's way. All he had to do was have the Niagara close with the Queen Charlotte. Perry would have that 2-to-1 advantage. The battle would be over in only a few minutes. But as Perry turned around to look, he was shocked to see the Niagara was not closing with the Queen Charlotte. In fact, the commander of the Niagara, Jesse Elliott, had brailed up the Niagara's jib and backed her main topsail, a maneuver for which, in all intents and purposes, held the Niagara dead in the water, put her in neutral. At this point in time, it now looked that Jesse Elliott was deliberately keeping his ship out of the battle. Was he? Well, that's something that's being argued to this very day. Two things we know for sure, and those are the two orders that Elliott was given to obey. And the first of those orders was to maintain your station in line. Now, the line of battle went all the way back to the British Navy's fighting instructions of 1653. You had two ships or two fleets sailed side by side, blasted away at each other until one side either surrendered, was sunk, or sailed away. The one thing you never did was break the line, not without a good reason, because if one ship broke the line, that would give an enemy an opportunity to sail through the line, cross the T, and rake the ships. So a captain never broke the line without very good reason. If he did, he would end up risking losing the battle and also losing his command and possibly losing his life if he was charged with cowardice. So what now happened was, as the Lawrence moved in against the Detroit, directly behind the Lawrence was the Caledonia, that small brig with only 3 guns. Now, the Caledonia would have had to go right past the Queen Charlotte, which had 17 guns. And the Queen Charlotte would have pounded the Caledonia into matchsticks. So the commander of the Caledonia, knowing he was in big trouble, also shortened sail to stay out of range of the Caledonia's or the Queen Charlotte's guns. Of course, Elliott in the Niagara, right behind the Caledonia, also was forced to shorten sail because he was obeying his order. He was maintaining his station in line. But after 15 or 20 minutes, Elliott realized he's not doing any good back here. His comrades up in the Lawrence are being blasted at. He's sitting back there. His guns are out of range. So now Elliott decides to sail around the Niagara, or around the Caledonia. And once he's past the Caledonia, it was now time to obey his second order. And that second order was to engage each your designated adversary in close range. Because before this battle started, Perry knew exactly what strength the British had. And his battle plan called for each of his vessels to engage a specific British ship. It was preordained. The Lawrence was going to fight the Detroit. And it was preordained that the Niagara was going to fight the Queen Charlotte. So once Elliott passed the Caledonia, all he had to do now was to follow that old military axiom, march to the sound of the guns, or in this case, sail to the sound of the guns. But again, Elliott didn't do that. In fact, what he did was he followed a course that put his own ships between the Niagara and the enemy line. His own ships masked his guns. He couldn't fire. Eventually, he opened up with a 12-pounder battle gun, but he stayed out of range of the 32-pounders. Why? Again, we don't know. Elliott later said he was trying to get all the way in front of the British line so he could break their line from the front and rake them. Now, he probably could have done the same thing by coming up astern of the British, but the reasons for what he did don't really matter. It's the outcome of his actions. Because now, the Queen Charlotte had no opponent for her guns because the Niagara was staying out of line. So the Queen Charlotte moved in front of the General Hunter and starts firing on the Lawrence. The General Hunter also is putting broadsides in the Lawrence. Now, the British Perry had help from a couple of the smaller vessels, but with 1 or 2 guns each, the British ignored them. They know they weren't a major threat. So by now, about 12:30 in the afternoon, the 3 largest British ships are concentrating all their fire on the lone American flagship. And this went on for the next 2 hours. Another phrase you often hear in naval fiction, something to the effect, the decks ran red with blood. In the case of the Lawrence, that was quite literally true. Marine Lieutenant John Brooks was standing right beside Perry on the quarterdeck of the Lawrence when he was struck in the hip by a solid cannonball. It ripped out his hip joint, his pelvis, and part of his stomach. He crumpled to the deck in absolute horrible agony. He was in such pain that he asked Perry to shoot him to put him out of his misery. Perry didn't have the heart to kill his friend. Brooks eventually was taken below deck to the surgeon, where after an hour of mortal pain, he finally died. Bosun mate William Johnson was struck on the chest by a grape shot, one of those plum-sized balls, probably fired at extreme range because it had lost most of its power. It didn't even penetrate his chest, it bounced off, but it had retained enough momentum to break 3 ribs on his left side. One of those ribs probably punctured a lung because 5 years later, Johnson died in a Pennsylvania poorhouse of a pulmonary disease. Marine Private David Christie was struck in the shoulder by a wood splinter, penetrated all the way through his chest and ended up down near his hip joint. Somehow he managed to survive, but he could never hold a job again because of his pain, and he died a few years later in an Arkansas poorhouse. Another Marine Private, John Garwood, was hit in the back of the head by a falling backstay block, and he crumpled to the deck with blood and other matter pouring from his ears. Suffered from bouts of temporary insanity for the rest of his life. Black seaman Jesse Williams, hit in the arm by a wood splinter, and he crawled along the deck below to the surgeon looking for help. And then there was seaman John Newen, who was struck in the head by shrapnel. He was taken below deck where he underwent the agonizing procedure of having his skull trephined, where a circular section of bone was removed from his skull so the surgeon could relieve the pressure and operate. And in addition to removing pieces of bone and pieces of shrapnel from the man's brain, he also took out a piece of Newen's tarred hat, which had been carried in by the wound. Newen did not survive the procedure. One by one, the men of the Lawrence were being shot down. But all the wounds here and injuries weren't necessarily being caused by cannonballs or wood splinters or musket balls from the British Marines. What was happening here also were accidents, because a lot of the men on these ships, as I said, they were soldiers. They weren't sailors. They never fought these big guns, ships at sea. They didn't really know what they were doing. One of these soldiers was a Pennsylvania militia private named William Brady. Now, Brady was serving as the shot and wad man on one of the heavy guns. It was his job to load the powder and the shot into the muzzle of the gun. But on the first shot, he misjudged the power of the weapon, and the muzzle blast blew off his shirt and burned his arm. Now, Brady was a smart fellow, learned his lesson, stepped out of the way for the second shot, but he stepped right into the path of a tackle block. And when the heavy gun recoiled, the tackle block smashed into his kneecap, and down he went. Another Pennsylvania private, John Lucas, stood too close behind a 12-pounder, and when the gun recoiled, the heavy wooden wheel of the truck rolled right over his foot and crushed it. Problem was, the gun reached the end of its recoil cycle, hit up against the breeching rope, and rebounded forward. And before anybody could reach him, the same wheel crushed the same foot a second time. Private William Smith of the 26th U.S. Infantry was manning the side tackle on one of the heavy guns. It was his job, once the gun was loaded, to heave on the side tackle to bring the gun back into the gun port, into battery, where it could be fired. But as they were heaving the line forward, the gun burst prematurely. Smith neglected to let go of the ropes. The rope burned through skin, muscle, and sinew. Later on in life, to support his wife and 9 children, Private William Smith had nothing but 2 clenched claws for hands and a pension of $8 a month to support that wife and 9 children. One by one, as I say, the men of the Lawrence were being shot down. And one by one, they crawled below deck to the surgeon looking for help. But once below deck, things weren't quite as good as these men might have hoped for, because normally in a ship of war, the sick bay is placed on the orlop deck, which is below the waterline. That way, if a cannonball crashes through the side of the ship, the men are below the waterline, they would be protected. Except the Lawrence was a shallow draft vessel. built for fighting in the western part of the lake. There was no orlop deck. And what they had to do was use the officers' wardroom as the operating theater. In fact, they used the officers' dining room table as the operating table. The surgeon of the Lawrence was sick, so 25-year-old surgeon's mate Usher Parsons was serving as the acting surgeon. Parsons was operating on the dining room table, bending over when a cannonball crashed through the side of the ship and passed only 6 inches over his head. At one point, he had just finished putting a tourniquet on the arm of 18-year-old midshipman Henry Laub. Still had his hand on Laub's arm when another cannonball crashed through and ripped Laub in half, hurling him to the deck, a shapeless, bloody bundle, dead. Seaman Charles Pohig, a Narragansett Indian, had also been wounded and had both arms splinted, was resting along the side of the bulkhead trying to recuperate when another ball crashed through and ripped through both his legs. He managed to last about another half hour. Suddenly, as Parsons was operating, he heard his name being called. And he looked up through the skylight onto the main deck, and there was Perry up on the deck fighting the ship. Now, Parsons had been assigned 6 helpers to hold the men down during operations or to bring the wounded below deck. But Perry was running short of men to fight the guns, and he asked Parsons to send one of his helpers up to fight the ship, and the man ran off. Now, repeatedly, the scenario was carried out until all 6 of Parsons' helpers were gone. Finally, Perry himself came down to the wardroom and asked if any of those who were slightly wounded, any of those who were sick before the battle, could help fight the ship. Several men crawled up to do what they could. One of those was carpenter's mate Wilson Mays, who volunteered to man the bilge pumps. After the battle, he was found still at a station, a British musket ball through his heart, dead. Simply not enough men. One by one, the men of the Lawrence were shot down. One by one, the guns were knocked out of action, until finally only one gun, the starboard gun, the aft gun on the starboard side, was left in battle. Perry himself helped man it along with the first lieutenant, the chaplain, and the purser, until finally this last gun also was knocked out of action. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the Lawrence was a floating, defenseless wreck. All the guns on her engaged side had been knocked out of action. Her sails looked like tattered strips, hung in tattered strips. Her rigging looked like tangled kite string hanging from a tree. Bulwarks like Swiss cheese. Every gun on her engaged side knocked out of action, and 4 out of every 5 men fit for duty either killed or wounded. 80% casualties. By comparison, the British at Balaclava in the charge of the Light Brigade lost 66%. Perry had just lost 80%. Perry now faced the dismal prospect of surrender. But there, about a quarter of a mile away, up came the Niagara, with nothing but the wind whistling through the throats of her heavy carronades. So Perry now made a fateful decision. The first thing he did was had the first cutter dragged up alongside. Now, the small boats on one of these ships, you didn't keep them on the deck during battle, because all that did was provide more wood splinters in case they were hit. So you always towed the small boats behind the ship. Perry had the first cutter hauled up alongside. It had been damaged, but it was still afloat. Then he had his Don't Give Up the Ship flag hauled down by a 17-year-old private of the 17th U.S. Infantry. The private handed the flag to Perry. Perry then turned over command to the wounded first lieutenant. Then he jumped down into that little rowboat and he headed off for the Niagara. Now, the British, they saw that little rowboat take off. They knew Perry was in it. They knew they had to stop him. All 6 British ships concentrated their fire on that little rowboat. Every man in it was soaked from the splash of cannonballs, but miraculously, not one of them was injured. Perry managed to reach the Niagara unscathed. Now, there seems to be some controversy over exactly what was said between Perry and Elliott when Perry boarded the Niagara. Now, one account says that as Perry came up onto the deck, Elliott walked up to him, looked him right in the eye, and said, "How goes the day?" Well, let's see. He had his ship shot out from under him. He suffered 80% casualties. He's losing the battle. He's not having a good day. And he, with typical laconic style, just simply said, "Badly." But something strange happened about this point. Here was Elliott in command of the ship, undamaged, ready to sail in, possibly win the battle and gain all the glory. But Elliott at this point volunteers to jump into that little rowboat, row all the way down along the battle line, board the smaller schooners, and bring them into battle. Now, why would he do this? Again, we don't really know. But Perry didn't care. Elliott wants to leave. Good riddance. Elliott jumps in the boat and rows away. Perry then surveys the Niagara's decks, orders the helm to be put up, sets all fighting sail, double shots her gun, and heads straight for the British line. Now, the British, in the meantime, they had pounded the Lawrence into a wreck. Make no mistake about it. But the Lawrence had given almost as much as she had taken. The British had suffered horribly themselves. Barclay himself had been wounded early in the battle, a splinter wound in his leg. But he had gone below deck to the surgeon, had been patched up, and he then came back up on to keep command. But now, just as the Niagara was approaching the British line, Barclay was hit in his remaining good arm, a severe wound. He had to be taken below deck. In fact, the captain and first officer of all 6 British ships had been either killed or wounded. The British ships were now commanded by junior officers. Now, these were brave men, make no mistake about it, but men who did not have experience fighting ships in battle or fighting a fleet action. But there's one thing these guys did know. When they saw the Niagara approaching their line, they knew they were going to have to take some sort of remedial action. Now, a lot of the guns on the larboard or left sides of the British ships had been knocked out of action, but their starboard guns had not been used. So if the British could wear ship, if they could turn around 180 degrees, they could bring 2 fresh broadsides to bear against the Niagara. The British could still win this battle. The order was given. The Detroit started to turn. But the Detroit had suffered a lot of damage to her top hamper, to her sails and rigging. She was moving, but she was moving painfully slow. The inexperienced commander, the Queen Charlotte, put up too much sail, and the Queen Charlotte was coming up fast. Finally, the Niagara, or the Detroit, couldn't do it. She had not enough headway. She got caught in irons and started to back down. And before the Queen Charlotte could do anything about it, the Queen Charlotte rammed her head booms right through the mizzen rigging of the Detroit. And now, at the most crucial phase of the battle, the 2 largest British ships were locked together and helpless. And as the great naval historian and philosopher Thucydides said in the 5th century BC, collision at sea can ruin your whole day. Well, that's precisely what happened to the British fleet. Perry sailed the Niagara right between the British line. With double-shotted broadsides, he opened up. As he came through, he backed the Niagara's main topsail and continued to pound the British fleet. Also, by this time, the wind had picked up. The smaller schooners were coming up astern of the British, and with their single heavy long guns, they were raking the British from the back. Eventually, as the Niagara continued to pound the British, the Detroit and Queen Charlotte did manage to break apart, but by that time, it was far too late. Rather than have all their ships sunk, all their men killed, the British started to surrender. The Detroit had her flag nailed to the mast, but she fired a gun off her disengaged side to indicate her surrender. The Queen Charlotte then lowered her flag, followed by the General Hunter and the Lady Prevost. But the 2 smallest British ships clapped on all sail and set a course for the Detroit River and tried to escape. Perry sent the Scorpion and Trip after them, and after a long stern chase and a shot across their bows, the last 2 British ships capitulated. The entire British fleet was captured. The first time in all of British naval history where they lost an entire fleet. I mean, the greatest navy in the world. For 125 years, the British had dominated the oceans of the world. They had defeated the British, or the French navies, the Swedish navies, the Russian navies, the French navies, everybody. And here it was, for the first time in their history, they lost an entire fleet. And it happened on a freshwater lake 500 miles from the nearest salt water by a fleet without a green wood in less than 6 months' time. This was a tremendous humiliation to the British Navy. Immediately after the battle, Perry realized he had to get a message off to William Henry Harrison. So he used his hat as a desk, and he found an old envelope. And on the back of that envelope, he wrote a message in pencil which read, "Dear General, we have met the enemy and they are ours. 2 ships, 2 brigs, 1 schooner, and 1 sloop. Yours with great respect and esteem, O.H. Perry." That afternoon, the 2 fleets anchored off West Sister Island. And just as the sun was setting, another act took place and all work stopped. Then 24 American seamen received their final reward. They received their glory for fighting in the battle. And that glory was a 6-foot patch of canvas, a 32-pound cannonball at their feet, and a 6-foot patch of mud at the bottom of Lake Erie, where they remain to this day. The glory for winning a battle. The next morning, the combined fleets, captured British and victorious American, sailed back into Put-in Bay Harbor. And the following morning, Sunday, the 6 officers that were killed in the Battle of Lake Erie were buried on South Bass Island. This was kind of a strange ceremony because normally military dead are strictly segregated. You have your British cemeteries, American cemeteries, French cemeteries. But these men were buried side by side. British, American, British, American, British, American. Really the first act in a peace that has lasted more than 185 years. This was the final act in the Battle of Lake Erie. But more importantly, Lake Erie was now in American hands. Over the next week and a half, Perry took Harrison's army and sailed them in stages over to the Canadian mainland. First to Put-in Bay, then to Middle Sister Island, then finally over to the Canadian mainland. One regiment of cavalry went across through the mainland up to Detroit, where they rendezvoused. The British, they had no choice. They were out of food, their fleet was gone. So they burned Fort Malden and retreated up the River Thames. Harrison's army followed them, and after about an 8-day chase, finally brought the British to bay at a place called Moraviantown, which was a peaceful Indian village along the Thames River. And there, the British turned to fight. Now, the British had a fairly strong position along the Thames River. They placed their regulars of the 41st Regiment on their left, with the flank anchored on the river. The Indians were on the British right, with their flank anchored in a swamp. The only way Harrison was going to be able to get to the British and Indian was by a frontal assault. And he knew that was going to leave a lot of dead American soldiers laying on that field. But as Harrison was surveying the British lines, his cavalry commander, Colonel Richard M. Johnson, later Vice President of the United States, came riding up. Now, Johnson wanted to make a cavalry attack. Well, Harrison had to think about that. I mean, the one thing he never did was send cavalry up against infantry in closed order. That's just asking for slaughter. But as Harrison looked at the British, he could see that they were not in closed order. In fact, Tecumseh advised that the British fight Indian style. So the British were in clumps behind trees in open order. Harrison thought maybe a cavalry attack would be the one element of surprise that will break the British line. So he divided the regiment. Half the British cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel James Johnson, Richard Johnson's brother, would go up against the British regulars. The other half of the regiment under Richard Johnson himself would go up against the Indians. The order was given, the cavalry charge started. On the right, Colonel James Johnson's men pushed forward. The British opened fire, and for a minute the men wavered. But then a single voice was heard on that field, and it yelled out, "Remember the raisin." And when that voice came out, suddenly it was taken up all along the line, because these were Kentuckians. And as these men marched up along this, following the British, they went through Frenchtown and ended up having to bury the bones of their comrades that were killed 9 months before. So these men were eager for revenge. And when that cry came up, they pressed on forward. They rode right through the British lines, wheeled their horses around, and in less than 5 minutes, 550 of the 600 British regulars dropped their guns and surrendered. Now you have to remember, I mean, these were the best trained, best disciplined army in the world. But these were men who lost a lot of their friends at Fort Meigs and Fort Stephenson. A lot of their friends had been on board the British fleet when it was captured. They had just burned their home of the last year. They had been retreating for 8 days through horrible weather. They had been destroying supplies all the way. They hadn't eaten for 48 hours, and they had a terrible commander to live with. These men did probably what anybody would do, any troops would do. They gave up and they surrendered. However, the Indians on the right flank fought desperately, because the Indians were fighting for their very lives. Tecumseh's voice could be heard all over the battlefield, rallying the troops. In fact, the Indians counterattacked and pushed the Americans back. But Harrison brought up infantry reinforcements and then pushed the Indians back to their original positions. Again, Tecumseh, his voice could be heard, exhorting his men, until Johnson himself, one of the few men still mounted who had been wounded 4 times, sat slumped on his horse. Finally, an Indian ran out of the woods, raised his musket, and fired. Johnson was hit a 5th time. Then the Indian raised his tomahawk and went running towards Johnson. Johnson barely managed to pull his pistol and shoot the Indian down before he himself was killed. Many later said that this was Tecumseh. Johnson never admitted it nor denied it. I mean, he'd been shot 5 times. He probably didn't know who it was. He had been taken off the battlefield immediately thereafter. But it doesn't really matter because Tecumseh was killed about this time. And with Tecumseh's death, the Indians melted off into the woods. And really, for all intents and purposes, as far as the Old Northwest is concerned, the Indians faded off into the history books. So it was these 2 battles, Lake Erie and the Thames, which pretty much ended the war in the Old Northwest. Of course, the War of 1812 went on for another year. A lot of bloody battles were fought, including the Battle of Lake Champlain. But it was these 2 battles that ended it in the Old Northwest. So, what's the significance of the Battle of Lake Erie? I mean, we're just talking another little naval battle fought in the middle of nowhere in a war that nobody knows or cares about? Well, look at it this way. Prior to the war, the British promised the Indians that if they won the War of 1812, the Indians would have their own nation, a buffer state between the United States and Canada. So it is conceivable, if the United States had lost the War of 1812, the 5 states that we know today as the Old Northwest, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, could today be part of Canada instead of the United States. And that's why the Battle of Lake Erie is so important in our history, and why 100 years later, this 352-foot granite memorial was built to commemorate Perry, his men, and his great victory. But that monument's also there for another reason, because probably for the only time in our history, we learned a lesson after a war. Now, the Treaty of Ghent ended the War of 1812. But 3 years later, the United States signed another treaty with Great Britain, and that was called the Rush-Bagot Agreement. And what the Rush-Bagot Agreement did was disarm the Great Lakes. Now, think about it. There's no warships cruising those lakes. There's no forts guarding the borders, no armies invading or waiting to be invaded. The longest undefended border in the world, more than 4,000 miles long, lies between Canada and the United States. So that monument, in addition to being a battle monument, is also an international peace memorial, the only international peace memorial in the entire national park system. And certainly as a peace memorial, that monument holds much greater significance than any battle monument ever could. Concludes the program. I hope you enjoyed it. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them for you. Otherwise, hope you enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Was Frenchtown and River Raisin considered the same?
They are the same. The river is the one that went by. Frenchtown sat on the north bank of the River Raisin. So yeah, they're synonymous. Americans call it the River Raisin Bridge. Of course, for us, it's the massacre of the River Raisin. For the Canadians, it's the great victory at Frenchtown. So depends on your perspective.
The man's a scholar.
Okay. Anybody has anything else, I'll be glad to hang around for a few minutes. Like I say, thanks again. Appreciate your coming.
We're here with Pat Schwartz, who is the mistress of the Interpretive Center on the 3rd floor of City Hall. You have just had the extreme pleasure of viewing that tremendous presentation by Jerry Altoff. That was pretty neat, wasn't it?
It really, really was. I mean, for those of us that are not that familiar with the Battle of Lake Erie, I mean, Jerry gave a very, sometimes graphic, but a personal description of what it was like for many of the soldiers that fought in that actual battle, and to hear some of the personal stories and what happened to some of these sailor soldiers at that point, and then to look at the planning of the American forces against the British, and sometimes they won and sometimes they didn't, and it was really, really an interesting presentation.
It's great. We only wish that more than that handful of people could have been there, but guess what? Right now, hopefully a few more will be able to view this, and maybe we'll be getting it on the airwaves around the North Country more than once, so that'll be good. Pat, you have to be excited to be a part of this whole process.
I've been very excited, and it kind of grows as things go along, because as the build-up has gone on, when I first started, it was just strictly for the summer, and it was basically learning a crash course about the Battle of Plattsburgh, because I had lived in Maryland for a while, and I was familiar with Fort McHenry and really never had heard of Plattsburgh, and it was like a crash course. And then to go from there through the first anniversary weekend, and then last year's anniversary weekend was the best that we've seen so far, and hopefully this year will be even bigger than that. But just to see the enthusiasm of the volunteers that we have, of the people involved in all of the Battle of Plattsburgh projects, it really kind of gives you a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of excitement. Sometimes we have our slow days, but for the most part, people are generally enthusiastic about everything that has to do with this.
People are delighted to have the interpretive center there in City Hall and to have it open on a regular basis. You're working with school kids, I bet you.
Well, we haven't had too many as of yet, but I have had a group of the North Country. The Regional North Country Center for Brain Injuries was in a few weeks ago, and we have a small group, an activities commission from St. Peter's that's supposed to be coming. I'm doing a tour for Dr. Frost, Richard Frost, who's doing a course at Plattsburgh State. He's asked me to do a presentation for his class. And we're in the process of working on a program to market to the schools, to get some of the schools in. The poster contest that's affiliated with the Battle of Plattsburgh weekend is starting up again, and we're in the process of contacting the schools for that program, and also to let them know what we have to offer for them, that we do have flexible programming and flexible schedules, and we can pretty much work with what they need. In last fall, we did quite a few kids from the local area, and we're trying to market to the kids outside of the area as well, and hopefully the teachers will be able to bring them in.
The focus of that interpretive center, as many of our viewers know, is that beautiful diorama that was done some time back, but you're jam-packing a lot of things into that little room these days. Let's do our little marketing right here on television and give people a rough idea what they're in for.
Well, we've got that 15-foot talking diorama. The lights light up, and that's the focal point of it. But we also have mannequins that are dressed in period citizen clothing that have been very generously loaned to us by one of our local reenactors, Sharon Lewis. We have in our cabinet, we have several cannonballs that have been found in the lake. We have various prints showing the principals in the battle, General Prevost, General Thomas McDonough, General McComb, plus various prints of uniforms and the battle itself. Plus we have a copy of the Secret Orders that was donated by the Prevost family a year and a half ago. So yeah, it's quite a bit, and we're in a small little room. We're really trying to get a lot in there, and we're working on it, and people come in and they show us things they have all the time, and sometimes we can only copy it, but we're starting to acquire some paper documents as well. So it's a growing operation. And to have the city support behind it has been really, really good.
And you know, we've mentioned a lot during the course of this program and most others that we do how important it is to inspire the young people to build up their love of history, and I think you've been doing that.
Well, we're trying. You know, and like I said, it's not just me. It's several volunteers that, again, marketing to various interests, who we can get at what time, and depending on scheduling, and to try to relate to the kids that, you know, how important this battle was, and it happened basically in their own backyard. I mean, we were just talking about the fact that showing the kids the cannonballs clearly demonstrates, you know, it's not a simple fight that they would see on TV there, where people get shot and they come back next week. I mean, when you talk about cannonballs in a battle with smoke and firing and not being able to hear and not being able to see, and the splintering that probably did more damage than actually getting hit by cannonballs to most of the men in the battle, and all of that, it's something that graphically can demonstrate what's going on. And we're working on this hopefully what they're doing in the Dean Mosher project will eventually become an exhibit that we are able to use to, again, clearly show the kids this is what it was like back in 1814. So there's a lot of programs that we're working on. Education's planning. Education has a group of people that are teachers and non-teachers that are starting to develop some programs where we have a website that will be built up very shortly. And over the course of the next year, I think you're going to see a lot more coming from the Interpretive Center.
And each year to come. I can't wait till you move out to the old stone barracks.
That in itself is going to be an excitement, because just knowing that, you know, to be on the base, to walk on the base, and to see some of the historic buildings that are there, and to think of the history that has gone through, not just in the War of 1812, but the history that's passed through that base and what's exactly around. And when you take a tour of Plattsburgh, just to look at the old structures, and I was just looking recently at the one of the plans for through the National Register of Historic Places, and the listing of old buildings that's on that list, and some of the houses I'm familiar with, and how what a unique opportunity we have for a number of marketing strategies that we could use to bring people in. And it's just like there's so many ideas sometimes we can't keep up with our ideas.
Well, every day is an education. That's the way I look at life. And you've been going to school a lot lately, haven't you?
I've been self-learning, going to school, and it's like even with like people like Jerry Altoff being here for the weekend. I mean, you're learning another facet because there's always something. I mean, I don't know everything about the battle. I don't know everything about the war. And Jerry's come in and brought. Matter of fact, Jerry brought me a present this week. He's given me a copy of the prize list for the Battle of Plattsburgh that I previously hadn't thought there was one. And Jerry brought me this as a present this weekend. And on the way home the other night from Burlington Airport, he says, "Oh, I have a present for you." And I said, "What's the present?" He says, "I brought you the prize list we were talking about because we'd been talking for a number of months about it." And to have information like that and be able to read some of these materials, it's a learning experience almost every day. Not just for me, but I think for everybody involved, because we kind of feed off each other.
That's great. That's great. It's been a wonderful experience for me, too. Pat, thanks so much for your hard work with the Interpretive Center. I can't wait to see what the future brings.
Oh, I think it's going to be changes all the time. You never know. It's one of those things where you can come to the work and you never know what's going to happen. So
that's great. It's like this program. You never know what's going to happen next. Pat, thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's Pat Schwartz of the Interpretive Center. I hope you take your family or your school class or your grandmother and grandfather and go down and check it out sometime. And you can be pretty sure another program soon or a little bit later will have to do with the Battle of Lake Champlain and the Battle of Plattsburgh. Gordy Little and Calvin Castine here for our Little Corner.